Freaks and Geeks was set in 1980, but the characters being relatable and authentic as high school students is a subtle nod to the cyclical nature of public high school in America. Like, no matter what year it is, these groups of students exist over and over again, taking on different forms as each character does throughout the season. Lindsay is rediscovering her identity after traumatically witnessing the final moments of her grandmother's life. Sam is terrified to leave adolescence as his world grows up faster than he can anticipate. Kim and Daniel have toxic relationships with their respective parents and, of course, each other. Bill and Neil have home environments that are each respectively beyond their control. Ken uses apathy and sarcasm to deflect his feelings. And Nick is being funneled into the army against his will because of imposed family values. This is not your typical high school drama because it's authentic to the problems kids go through. The characters are experiencing adversity, which drives the core of what makes Freaks and Geeks a masterpiece of a first season: character development. One of the most compelling episodes, and one of my favorites because I think it tells us a lot about Nick and Lindsay, is episode 6, I'm With the Band. Throughout the series, we see that Nick has this fantasy of himself as a drummer, which the closer he orients towards, the less respect his father has for him. We also learn this episode that Nick's closest friend Daniel even perceives Nick as kind of hopeless, that he'll just eventually cater to his father's demands of going into the military, just like Nick's older brothers did.
I didn't break up the band. I just wanted to help Nick.
Nick doesn't need any help.
How can you say that? If he doesn't make it as a drummer, then he has to go into the army.
What? He's not gonna make it as a drummer. So why don't you just let him have some fun before he has to ship off?
Yeah, well, you sound just like his dad.
Maybe his dad is right.
I can't believe you're saying that.
Lindsay, he's not gonna be the next Keith Moon. So if he's got someplace to go that's gonna take care of him, why don't you just stay out of his way?
Daniel, that is not how it has to be.
Oh. Okay.
The episode opens with Nick using dry ice as a prop in his basement while drumming along to Rush, and then we see that he is the leader of this terrible band that the friend group plus Goldberg put together. Meanwhile, Lindsay's desperate to help Nick achieve his dream because Lindsay, basically running an experiment on how naive she is, assumes that just like with her perfect grades, if Nick works as hard at becoming a drummer as she did at school, then he can also achieve his dreams. Life is that easy, is Lindsay's hypothesis, and Nick is her test subject. The fantasy is shattered when Nick's suddenly rigid attitude breaks up the band before he's humiliated at an audition for a different band, which he only went to after Lindsay encouraged him to go. Lindsay, maybe feeling partially responsible for building Nick's hopes up only for them to be crushed, remediates his low mood by kissing him, and by the end of the episode, Lindsay is now putting the dry ice in the cooler, like she is the one taking on responsibility for propping up Nick's delusions, something he can't do for himself after confronting the massive roadblocks to his aspirations. This episode captures just how heinously subtle those feelings of insecurity and hopelessness can be. We watch Nick go from this sparkling, artificial feeling of unlimited potential that fades with pressures and expectations of the institutions that he's just now conceptualizing he's captive to. He may be passionate about being an artist, but there's this desperation in his attempt to become one. Like, he knows his enlistment to the army is inevitable, and he's already on that train, so all he has is this fantasy until then. Lindsay wants to help her friend to validate her own understanding of a system that rewards hard work and commitment, but she faces the reality that not everyone has the ability to support or confidence to achieve their dreams, and she is now the dry ice facilitator of her own fantasy in that way too. Freaks and Geeks hinges on these tiny details, and the show's largely about how each character's changing sense of self agrees or disagrees with their environment and the expectations that have been built up around them. Lindsay's character is a flawless testament to the typical intelligent teenager who acts above the trials and tribulations of being a teenager, while ironically and kind of hypocritically falling into the typical pitfalls of teenage idealisms like rebellion and indignation and naive self-assuredness. Sam has this innocence that he's struggling to let go of as he confronts the end of his adolescence, mostly represented in his toys. We watch him trick or treat when he's too old, throw out his Tonka trucks, and then nearing the end of the series, he's apathetic while playing Rat Trap with Bill and Neil because he's preoccupied with thoughts of Cindy. Sam is determined to keep up with his peers while also being terrified of adulthood as he abandons the traditions that just days before defined him. The staples of Sam's adolescence kind of no longer serving him is also represented when Sam and Neil are waiting outside of Bill's hospital room after Alan puts peanuts in Bill's sandwich. Sam laughs with Neil about how Bill could be their ghost buddy until he looks over at Bill's mother, who's crying, and they realize the harsh reality of the situation. The problems they used to easily whisk away with these Casper-like fantasies have developed into a more formidable opponent when he witnesses the adult-sized repercussions of just the potential of Bill's death on his mother's face. Then the story dives even deeper into her suffering, and we learn that her feeling isn't just dread, but guilt too, when she's reflecting to Jean on her perceived shortcomings as a mother. Freaks and Geeks presents these archetypes, freaks, geeks, bullies, jocks, and so on, just to establish the wide spectrums of individuality that exist within those archetypes, which people are constantly drifting between anyway. We see just how fragile those lines are and how there have been models that are vaguely followed since the 80s and probably before, but just by existing, those models are then entirely ignored and contradicted. We watch Lindsay transition from geek to freak, so to speak, because of a major shift in perspective, presumably as a result of the death of her and Sam's grandmother. But we also see it with Sam growing out of his adolescence, Nick adopting disco, Daniel going to play Dungeons and Dragons, and Ken dating Amy. Even the tertiary characters are each microcosms of the American teenager's changing sense of self. Millie's moral compass is rattled by the hit and run on her beloved family pet, and she begins to rebel like Lindsay. Alan expresses the vulnerability and insecurity driving his bullying, and even the gym teacher takes on newer dimensions throughout the show. Instead of teaching a moral lesson or trying to pander to the audience with an ironic or coincidental force-fed conclusion, Freaks and Geeks is a show about the intricacies of character development in any given high school at any given time. Change is not just a theme of Freaks and Geeks, it is the plot itself. Given that we never saw a second season, the last scene being Lindsay lying to her parents and jumping into a van to follow the Grateful Dead for the summer while the Dead's Ripple plays in the background will always be one of my favorite moments in TV history. And that's not just because we watch Lindsay finally lean into the arc of her own metamorphosis that she has been tiptoeing along the entire season along with so many other characters, but it's also because the final frame we ever get of Freaks and Geeks is the main character beginning her journey and driving away from the camera like the show itself is leaving us. That is such compelling irony that a series which never should have been cancelled would end with the audience watching the protagonist drive away to embark on a journey that mainstream television didn't value enough at that time to follow, leaving the undeserving, unappreciative audience on the proverbial curb with nothing more than those 18 episodes to speculate on the other half of all these characters' arcs that the showrunners were barely reaching the precipice of. Typically, shows that end prematurely are bittersweet because they don't provide the closure that the audience is looking for, and any of the kind of expectations of where the characters go are left completely unfulfilled. Freaks and Geeks is different in that we know from the show's hints throughout the season, and of course from what Judd Apatow has said about it, exactly where the Freaks and Geeks are probably going to end up. But we don't get to watch them get there. Bill might become a jock, Millie maybe a punker, Daniel a Dungeons and Dragons AV kid, Nick a dance guy or I don't fucking know what, Sam an adult, Kim a mother, Lindsay a burnout. There's so much more potential in the characters and who they would be by season 2 that's the worst part about season 1 of Freaks and Geeks, how well they set up season 2 only for it to never happen. But still, the originality, the themes, its short-lived fate, its legacy, its soundtrack, I can't recommend this one season of television enough. It's my favorite single season of television that exists, which is painfully ironic because it's the only season of Freaks and Geeks there will ever be.